gentlemen, I am duty bound to inform the listeners before we tackle this first question that we are indeed recording this on Thursday afternoon before the Europa League semi-final second legs have been played, due to our upcoming live show performances and not being around to be able to record this. So we are recording them before the inevitable
before
Harry
Bodo Glimt 4, Tottenham 0.
Before Spurs crash out and Harry Maguire gets a winning goal to send Man United through, or whatever happened. You know, we don't. But we're going to talk about this. We're going to tackle this question anyway from Adam Heath on email, because whatever happened last night, as you're listening to this, it is still relevant. I think with one of Manchester United or Spurs primed to win the Europa League, and we assume that that's still the case today, and with it a Champions League spot next season, does this make a bit of a mockery of the competition given their respective league form? Now, of course, if they have crashed out, it has been quite remarkable how well these two have done in this very, very prestigious competition compared to how piss poor they've been in the Premier League, Andy Brassel.
Yeah, and I think Adam's right. I don't think you can separate their league position and how well they've done in this competition, actually, because we've seen far superior teams to this Manchester United and this Tottenham Premier League teams basically been off the competition before because they didn't feel it was important enough to them. So I think the fact that they're so far off European qualification in terms of the league has focused their minds and sort of made them contenders out of necessity, really. Of course, they should be all in for it anyway because it's a big competition. But I guess when we're talking about, you know, what the integrity of a competition is really about, it is quite a difficult question because I've talked about this a bit on the Ramble recently and a bit on OTC as well. The fact that probably the Europa League is more morally sustainable now because you don't have the teams falling out of the Champions League group stages, the lucky losers, and joining the competition at the halfway stage. And I think all of us instinctively would say that's a good thing, that's a fairer thing, it makes for a clearer competition, it's not a charter for losers, etc., etc., etc. But on the other hand, I don't think we can deny that it's made for a weaker knockout stage of the competition. And I think we've seen that from the quarterfinals onwards, probably. And, you know, the reality is that these English teams, because they've had such a poor domestic season, have been forced to play this to the end. So they're just doing what other previous Europa League contenders have done. It's just unusual to see Premier League clubs in this situation and two Premier League clubs of this size in this situation. So I can understand why you might be questioning the fibre of the competition and actually how good it is. But I don't think it makes a mockery of the competition, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Do you just think it's more of a case of an unusual season, Luke Moore?
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Yeah, I would say though that I don't think it makes a mockery of the competition because, of course, UEFA are perfectly capable of making mockeries of their own competitions themselves. We don't need Man United beating Bilbao in Bilbao for that to happen. But I would say it's worth mentioning the idea that the might of the Premier League is imbalancing to the rest of Europe. And I understand Andy saying that, you know, because United and Spurs have effectively written off their league season so early because it's been so chaotic and so difficult for them domestically, that definitely speaks to the strength of the Premier League more broadly for a couple of reasons. One, I would say because if you look at the revenues that UEFA reported the Premier League were getting, and I think it was only a couple of months ago now, the Premier League's basically bringing in terms of revenue, the same money as the La Liga and Bundesliga put together. I think it's about $7 and a bit billion for the Premier League and then $3.5 each for La Liga and the Bundesliga, right? So the spending power is enormous. And then in terms of, aside from the fact that, you know, the Champions League teams aren't going into the Europa League, which is a massive part of it, and Andy's spot on with that, I would also say the middle kind of rump of the Premier League strength now is really quite good. And I think you don't really, if you put aside the teams who have completely lost touch with the Premier League standard, i.e., Ipswich, Leicester, Southampton, the teams that have come up, there's a good lump of teams all the way down to about 13th probably, maybe even 14th if you include Everton, since they've been quite resurgent under Moyes, that can actually give you a bloody nose and worse on any given day in the Premier League. So
but it
I don't
partly
think
plays into where Tottenham and United are, isn't it? You know, they're big clubs that can't get away with coasting.
Totally, but they probably can get away with coasting in the Europa League. I don't think. I was just trying to look this up when you were talking, Andy. I don't think from memory Man United have lost a game in the Europa League this season.
No, they've not.
Right?
I think the bigger problem is, I mean, look, we can only know, like, it's a very small sample size. This is the first season that we've had the expanded Champions League, and it's had the knock-on effect on the Europa League, which I guess is something that people didn't really think about beforehand. But I wanted to ask you, Marcus, like Lars floated a really interesting idea, I thought, because I think it affects the Conference League even more, because we've got this situation where Chelsea are going to get in Chelsea will be in the final. I feel, even with the chronology of this pod, I feel safe saying
they're going to win the competition,
and they're likely winners. Aston Villa should have won it last year. West Ham did win it the year before. Whether it's it doesn't look like it'll be City anymore next season, which is very disappointing to me. But it might be, for example, an Aston Villa or a Nottingham Forest, who definitely Villa and probably Forest would be favourites for it. I think it's fair to say. Now, when we're talking about imbalance, this is something on an industrial scale. This is something totally different. I mean, Lars had a really interesting idea. He floated that if you earn over 100 million in TV money a year, you shouldn't be allowed to compete in the Conference League. What do you reckon to that?
Well, I think you might see some creative accountancy if that is the case.
I mean, that's the first one to make.
Well, that rules Marcus out then. He can't enter it.
Absolutely not.
His revenues are way above that.
People think I earn a lot more than I do, but I get all this stuff off Vinted in charity shops. But I think...
Which, by the way, the Conference League is very much the charity shop competition of European football, so it makes sense.
It is. Any cup's good to win. Ask the organisers of Le Tournoi. But I think to sort of briefly touch on the question, I don't think it does make a mockery of Europa League this season with what Man United and Spurs have done. I think it's just funny. It's just very, very funny and amusing for us fans of the Premier League over here. It's annoying for the rest of Europe, I understand that, who have been in the competition. But that's just the way it goes. I think it's an anomaly. You've already talked about that, Andy. I think it's more of an odd season. I think it does make a bit of a mockery of the Conference League. I don't want to start this whole debate again, but if I may just, without sounding like, 2010, if you remember back in the day, and when I say, as in these chats were being had around that year or whenever it was, if you remember back in the day, it was the Cup Winners' Cup was the third tournament, which was for the Cup winners. Whereas how they've tiered it now is you have obviously Europe's elite and the champions in the Champions League, and then a load of teams from England, Italy, Spain, wherever else, and it all just kind of knocks down. But because of the strength and the financial power of the Premier League, by the time you get to the Conference League, it's so bloody obvious that the haves and have-nots are so stark that I think Europa League is still okay. We could start to see maybe the Premier League, but although having said that, this decade or this century, you could go as far back to say you've had 4 English winners of the Europa League, starting with Liverpool in 2000, 2001. UEFA Cup, it was then. So I don't think English teams are going to dominate, and I don't think they will dominate the Europa League. The Conference League is where it's a bit of a mockery. Should there be a cap on the spending? I think that's very hard to implement, and I think teams would feel it. I can't see that happening, to be quite frank.
It can't be acceptable in terms of like competition law and stuff like that, surely. Because what you're saying is, we have no motive or reason to increase how functional and how efficient we are as a business in selling merch and making your profit on players or whatever it may be. Because the moment we become too 100 million for revenue, by the way. I mean, how much did Brighton sell Moises Caicedo for? That, I think it was about that. So you're going to have to think about whether that's realistic, because what you're saying is...
I don't know. So you can't have a go at Andy.
Yeah, I don't remember the detail on what Lars actually said, but just extrapolating, Brighton aren't a massive club, They're they're not a massive club. There's no way you could feasibly, morally outlaw Brighton from the Conference League. I mean, that would be mad.
I think the other thing is as well, I mean, Mark Bosnich said to me last week that it's right to have those big English teams in it because part of the attraction of the competition is that a team from Slovenia or the team that finished third in the Swedish league gets to play them.
Yeah. Sure.
And that's something that they're welcome. So I think we have to be really careful when you're talking about the value of a competition. There's always a really difficult balancing act between what's a healthy level of competition and what actually makes it attractive. And that's where Premier League clubs can kind of muddy the water, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, yeah. But look, last time round in the Conference League, it was Olympiacos who won it. Olympiacos are not going to win the Champions League.
First Greek team ever to win a European trophy.
There you go. Unlikely to win the Europa League. So actually, the Europa Conference League does serve its purpose. It's just when Chelsea are in it, because when West Ham were in it the first time round, to be fair to you, Andy, you called it out and said, "Come on, look at their budget." But the fact is, though, it was amazing for West Ham. I think it's more the fact that it's Chelsea this season. I think that's why. It's kind of
because we're used to them hitting hard in the big European competition.
And it's also going back to the question. It's also the fact that Spurs and United have been so farcically bad in the Premier League this season. It makes it look more stark. They've been laughably poor. If each of them had 10 points more each, and they're both sitting in mid-table, you'd probably go, okay, it's probably about right. Europa League level, whatever. It wouldn't seem as weird. And it's also because the clubs are so big as well, right? I do think there's something in what Andy said at the top, which is that, they've been able to write off their league season. It was over. It was done ages ago. So therefore, that golden ticket into the Champions League is there, so you prioritise it.
Yeah, interesting one that. We'll see where United and Spurs are next season. We've got one from Max on Instagram here. After Inter and Barcelona played out a game for the ages, what do you think makes a perfect game of football?
Ooh. It's got to be very keenly contested and it has to have an intensity about it. One immediately thinks goals, not necessarily. I think it's good because a 1-1 can be a great game or 2-1. I'm reluctant to say 0-0 is a great game of football or a perfect game of football was the wording of the question. So I think there has to be the ball hitting the back of the net somewhere in there. Don't necessarily have to have a sending off and say, oh, that game had everything, sending off, penalties, blah, blah, blah. But I would say you need a goal. I would probably say at least 2 goals, maybe, if I'm going to be particularly accurate on the detail. Because I think without the cheer, without that explosion of joy and jubilation, I'm not sure you could say it was a perfect game. But I think the intensity and the back and forth nature of it, I would say, being a very keenly contested match would be the immediate things that I would think of.
I would say that the great thing about football is there's so many different ways of enjoying a game, right? And there's so many different interpretations of what makes a good team and what makes your favourite team. And some people would say, for example, that classic Barcelona side were the best team I've ever seen. Some people would say they're a bit boring, a bit kind of formulaic, a bit systematic. For me, so there's opinions in there, right? But for me, I think it goes back to what I was saying on Wednesday's Ramble after the Inter-Barca game. To me, it's about the inability to control the outcome, which makes it exciting. Like I can have admiration for the way that peak Mourinho teams like to play, or peak Guardiola teams like to play, or the nature of how, going back a bit when Chris Wilder brought Sheffield United into the Premier League and were playing in quite an interesting way. I can have admiration for all that. But sometimes we forget, I think, that the task in front of a top manager is very different to the task of what we've got as a fan, which is to get enjoyment out of the game. They're not necessarily have a vested interest. They don't necessarily have a vested interest in getting a best game out of it. In fact, they probably don't want
that's what a manager says in the post-match, don't they? If it's a 4-3 or something, they go, well, that was a good one for the fans or the neutrals.
Yeah. Whereas for me, I think I like the same way I consume a lot of entertainment. I want to be entertained by not essentially knowing what's happened. If I go and watch a movie and it's really formulaic and you can predict the next step over and over again till the film ends, it's like, is that a good movie? Not really. You want to be surprised. You want to be led on a journey to an extent. And I think with football, it's the same for me. So there's many different ways to deliver that, I think. But to me, it's about that difference between controlling outcomes and not being able to control outcomes. As a fan, I like it to be unpredictable.
I 100% agree with that. And it's all about the jeopardy.
Did you agree with mine, Andy?
That's what made Inter Barcelona. That's what made Inter Barcelona as good as it was, because from the first minute of the first leg, it's all on the line.
It's all
don't know
intense and keenly competitive. Yep, totally agree with you.
And it
just like Marcus said, Andy.
and it just continues like that. And I think what has made this stand out so much is not just because it was a great game, 2 great games, a great tie, not just because the teams was so different as well and are so different, but because we've become really unused to seeing that. Now, if we're going to bring in like the second Champions League final, which I thought was a really enjoyable second leg actually, from the way that Arsenal went at it, and that really added something to it if we're talking about jeopardy. It was really interesting to hear Mikel Arteta argue that Arsenal had been the better team afterwards. And how he based it upon was the fact that Donnarumma had 2 great games, or at least one really great game, and made a couple of good saves in the first one. But I kind of think that the way we look at football now is, certainly top-level football, is we look at someone like Donnarumma, for example, and think, well, because he plays for PSG, he should be practically unemployed. So it feels like if he's made some saves,
I know what you mean
that means the other team must have dominated. But it's not true.
Yeah.
Like Arsenal were definitely not the better team over those 2 legs, by the way, even though they had a really good go in
even
the
though the
leg.
PSG bench told Mikel Arteta that they were.
yeah, they definitely did.
I made the point on
What is he talking about?
I made the point on
French is a little bit rusty.
I made the point on Reacts, Andy, that Donnarumma is a part of the team of PSG.
Yeah.
So if he plays well, that goes into the collective playing well. I get the fact that I know that's slightly splitting hairs in some arguments, because if
I agree with you, it's not. I don't think it is.
Well, in certain circumstances and particular examples, maybe, but not with that game. But sorry, Andy, you were going to make a point.
Yeah, no. I think you're quite right to bring that up, because it's as if we talk about a goalkeeper's good performance as luck, which I find extraordinary. Really, I agree with you on that. But we're so used to seeing in so many top level games, not just one-way traffic, but games that you go into where there is no jeopardy, when you know that a certain team is going to win, and in a lot of cases where you know which team is going to win a certain league as well. We've seen that be the case in Italy, be the case in Germany over a number of years, although fortunately not in recent years, and same with Italy. Serie A has been very unpredictable in recent years. But I think we're conditioned through seeing so much football where you have boxer plus punch bag, that we sort of think that, okay, if the other team has had a glimmer, if the other team has had an opportunity and it's not outright domination, like reading too much into it. And I think that is why this Inter-Barcelona game stands out so much. Not just because it's chaotic, but it's chaotic in a modern context where you have 2 top-level teams with very differing styles absolutely going toe-to-toe. And that is so rare nowadays. And I'm not arguing with people who are out there saying it's the best Champions League semi-final or the best knockout. I think there's plenty to recommend that. All I'm saying is, in the modern context, it's such an outlier. It's so unusual. And if you had more football that was even 65, 70% like that, football would be much better.
I also love when one team absolutely pumps another team, but the other team's supposed to be at the same level as them. So I'm not talking about when, like someone whoops a non-league team in the FA Cup. I mean, like when, Man United beat Arsenal 8-2.
Germany
like,
7,
the drama
Brazil
of
1.
that. Yeah, exactly. The drama of that is quite difficult to top, just as as a kind of as an observer, you're like, wow, this is like proper. It genuinely feels like actual drama when that stuff happens.
It's like the entertainment of an unbelievably drunk friend trying to get back on their feet.
Yeah, like that. Well, yeah, Andy, you don't bring yourself into it. Don't make it all about you, Andy.
I'm going to say. On that note, Andy, I think we should have a break. Back in a second with more of your questions.
We're going on tour. That's right, Football Ramble Time Tunnel is hitting Newcastle, Birmingham, Manchester, London and Glasgow between the 9th and the 17th of May. Get your tickets by clicking the link in the top corner of this video now.
Welcome back to the mailbag, everybody. Luke Moore, what have you got for us, big guy?
I've got a question from Jake on Instagram. Hello to you, Jake. Jake asks, with all the talk around Trent Alexander-Arnold this week, what do you think matters more in defining the greatness of a player at a club? Is it loyalty and longevity, or the impact they have by winning trophies, etc.?
I think it's crucial that they are not a rodent or a serpent. If they're one of those things...
What about a lizard?
Yeah, I haven't thought about that. It's a boring thing to start this question with, but context kind of dictates here. Because I find it... I love how much Newcastle United fans love Les Ferdinand. Sir Les, they call him. What was he there, 2 years? He's not from the area.
2 years.
He never won anything. He scored a lot of goals. Gave him some good times and a bit of cheer. And that was it. But my goodness, they love the man. And I love the fact that they love that man. And that kind of defies it, really, because one might say, well, he left a bit too early, He could have stayed on, and were they annoyed with him, or blah, blah, blah. It hasn't stopped their love for him. So context is crucial. I mean, you get some really quirky cult heroes as well at football clubs. I mean, Hearts fans of a certain age will know who Wayne Foster is. Scores the goal against Hibs, is a cult hero. Like, he's loved by a certain those who remember that. That's all he really did. He made a contribution, and I think that did the player make the? I think the impact in Jake's question, the impact they have is. I think that's what you're talking about here, because if it was a guy who's a bit of a journeyman or didn't really settle too much, didn't play that long, well, he got his goal, he knocked out the Hibs, or was it the guy who came in and got us over the line to win us the trophy, or was it the guy who was top scorer for a couple of seasons when he came? It's all about the impact. So to say the greatness of a player of a club and look at, say, numbers and so on, yeah, that can be indicative, but that all goes into the idea of what was the impact they had on the fans.
Yeah. Also, a lot of clubs don't ever get a chance to win a trophy anyway.
No.
So I mean, you can't always have that situation where you have to use that as a criterion.
You're absolutely right, and you're right as well, Marcus, to point out context. And I think when we're judging the greatness of a player at a certain club, I guess a little bit like Liverpool fans are feeling this week with how some of them are judging Trent Alexander-Arnold. It's incredibly difficult to judge if you're not a fan of that club. Do you remember when Jude Bellingham left Birmingham?
Yeah.
And there was talk that they were going to name a stand after
retire his shirt number and all that.
Yeah, and it became a bit of a joke, like, because people were saying, "Oh, this guy's a teenager. He's like only played like one full season." But actually, if you know Birmingham, you know, like, he was someone who not only gave everything while he was there, but could have walked away for nothing, didn't, signed a proper contract, got the club 25 million that stopped them from being in a really horrendous financial position. He got it. And I think that's it. Sometimes it's quite indefinable. A player who gets it. Obviously, they can't be a terrible player. They have to be a player of at least good to moderate competence to find their way to cult hero-ness. I guess we're talking about, great players versus cult heroes. That was part of what you were talking about, wasn't it, Marcus? But I think what Bellingham has, outside that and outside understanding the context of Birmingham, I would like to think that Dortmund and Real Madrid fans in particular understand exactly what makes Bellingham so popular now. Because both at Dortmund and at Real Madrid, he is a player who connects with the crowd like few others. Now, it's one thing being able to do that at Birmingham. It's another thing entirely being able to do it in 80,000 capacity Westfalenstadion or to have the Bernabeu in the palm of your hand. And I think that's sometimes where the match-going football experience comes into it. I'm not diminishing the passion or the importance of the feelings of fans from all over the world who follow clubs that are far from them in a very, very committed way. But I think it's interesting, say, within the first year that Jude Bellingham was at Real Madrid, it was clear that they loved him. The crowd at the Bernabeu loved him more than they'd ever loved Cristiano Ronaldo.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about people who are like Ronaldo obsessives. And, he is one of these superstars, a little bit like, Messi, Neymar, whatever, that people get in their zone about them.
Yeah.
But realistically, you have to accept that match-going Real Madrid fans connect with Jude Bellingham in a way that they never connected with Cristiano Ronaldo. Now, of course, he went along more than the goal a game for 9 years. They respect him, they admire him, they're grateful for the contribution. But it's funny how he turn around every so often and go, after everything I've done for this club, I get the chip. And it's funny that, they didn't get him, he felt, but he didn't get them either. And that comes down to personality, with Bellingham.
It comes down to personality. It's interesting you mentioned that, Andy, because I was going to say that at the risk of sounding a bit mischievous, it's arguably not that hard to be really, really loved at a club as a player.
I would,
because I think really the basics are, well, you say the right things, you try really hard for the shirt, you talk about loving the club, you really, I mean, that's really pretty much all you've got to do, right?
Some kind of acknowledgement of the fans, a little wave as you go off as a sub, a little sort of fist pump. You don't have to be this raging extrovert like, say, Jude Bellingham is. I think.
But on the other hand, would you not say that's a harder thing? I'm not just trying to make this about Real Madrid, but it's a harder thing to do at Real Madrid because superstardom, by its nature, almost conveys a sort of remoteness. And actually, that's what fans don't love, isn't it? Fans like to feel that you understand that they're there and you understand why they're there, and just you get it. You don't even need to explicitly say, I love this club, I'll love this club forever. All that sort of stuff. It is, like Luke's saying, it's just kind of respect and acknowledgement, really, isn't it?
Yeah, you do it in your own way. I mean, look at Eric Cantona at Man United. They still chant his name. Yeah, I mean, how aloof and mercurial and enigmatic was Cantona? Still is.
That's about charisma. That's about delivering them to like a higher level. It's about charisma.
But wasn't there when they won the treble? Obviously, he'd retired.
I think it's quite an individual thing. I think if I think of the team I support, Portsmouth, people love Alan Knight, right? And the reason they love Alan Knight is because he played, whatever it was, 700 odd games for Portsmouth, stayed there his whole career, had offers to go elsewhere, didn't want to do it, wanted to stay where he was, right? And then Southampton fans would say the same about Matt Le Tissier, right? And Knight is an all-time legend in Portsmouth and at Fratton Park. There's other players though who have won FA Cups, and won't be considered anywhere near that kind of level of dedication from the fans and be loved anywhere near as much. So I don't think it's about trophies. I think it's about all the stuff you guys have described in the whole
connecting to the fan base.
Really, yeah, I think so.
However you do it.
Yeah. Quickly, just before we move on, like the Trent thing, which is the lens through which we're being asked this question, that's another tricky one because I think there are particular fan bases who are in a position where they, genuinely feel like there's no other place to go but down if you leave the club, and therefore can't understand why you want to leave. And if the moment you do leave, your legacy is going to be tarnished in a lot of their eyes. Now, that's not going to happen at somewhere like Portsmouth. Like Darren Allerton, brilliant for Portsmouth in the early 90s, goes to Spurs for loads of money, supports Spurs, whatever. It's a Premier League club. Everyone wishes him all the best. There's no kind of ill feeling about that, right? That's obviously clearly not going to happen at a club like Liverpool for very, very different reasons. So I think there's a whole load of stuff taken into account there. And Marcus, you're right to say at the start, a lot of this stuff is quite inexplicable. It's because someone made an amazing last-ditch tackle or scored one goal or, there's a great example at Portsmouth with Pedro Mendes. Everyone loves Pedro Mendes at Pompey, and the reason for that is he scored the goal, I think it was against Man City, that basically triggered the run of results, which meant that Portsmouth stayed up in the Premier League.
Yeah.
Now, that's quite obscure. You're not going to know that unless you're a Portsmouth fan. That's quite a deep cut, but that's the kind of thing that carries over to the fans. So I think it could be a whole range of different reasons as to why, for example, Mendes is never going to have to buy a pint in Pompey ever again if he drinks pints. Probably not. Sagres maybe. Bit of Superbock here and there. But again, Prosinecki, there for one season. Legend. Absolute legend. Completely different reasons. So there's loads of reasons, I think, why it
And with
can happen.
Prosinecki, it's the fact that I can't believe this guy's come here. He's come to entertain us. Now, whether that is his motivation or not, it doesn't matter. The fact is he turned up and he did it.
Yeah.
So there could be
And we finished about 17th in the Championship that season and had no other good players.
safe from relegation. Yeah.
If you look at the YouTube videos of the players that are celebrating Prosinecki's goals with him, it is an unmitigated disgrace. Honestly, it's like it's just Football Manager regens.
Right, let's have a quick break. Welcome back to the mailbag, everybody. We're going to finish with this question from CNFFC. Do you think Nottingham Forest's style of football is sustainable? And will it be effective should they make next season's Champions League? I think it suits the way knockout football is sometimes played, brackets tense, low-scoring games. What do you think, Luke?
I mean, I think that if he thinks they're tense, low-scoring games in the Champions League, he's not watched football the last week or so. But I do take the point. I wonder whether, though, this is quite a difficult time to answer this question, chiefly because Nottingham Forest themselves might well be proving that their style of football isn't sustainable right to the bitter end, because they've not kept a clean sheet for well over a month now. They're in the worst run of form they've been in pretty much all season, although I know they had a bit of a wobble back in November. And it may see them dropping out of the Champions League places permanently. Obviously, at the time of recording, they're 6th. They've got some winnable games coming up, so we don't know what's going to happen. But I actually think in the round, if you take how they've played and how they've been most effective this season, I think it probably would be quite effective in Europe. But part of the reason, to bring it full circle, is going back to what we talked about at the start of the show, which is because of the might of the Premier League. And if you look at the amount of money Nottingham Forest have spent on players, I mean, Andy would be able to tell much better than I can, but how many of those even Champions League teams can spend that much money in such a short amount of time and attract the players, the wages and the prestige of the league, as much as Forest can? Like, I remember Andy talking earlier in the season about Milenkovic going to Forest. You're like, well, it's amazing. It shows you the power of the Premier League that they can get him, because loads of people wanted him and he's ended up at Nottingham Forest. So I think it is probably conducive overall if they can maintain it and deliver on their early promise this season, because they are good at keeping teams out generally. They're good at breaking quick. And I do understand the idea that that's probably quite well suited to knockout football, but of course it depends who they're playing, and it depends if they can sustain it themselves. And at this point in the season, they've not been that good, pretty much ever since Marcus and I predicted them to do it and get into the Champions League. So you're welcome, Nottingham Forest fans. That's probably partly on us. But Andy, what do you think on some of those points I've made there? Can you build on those in terms of the what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think in theory, Forest in the Champions League looks really good because, as you say, globally over the season they've defended excellently. They've been compact. They've been well organised. They've got the tools to counter-attack really quickly. Then you've got the added element of Chris Wood being able to score goals from completely different situations. Look, there are a lot of caveats. I think it's if they make it, which, again, as you said, looks like it might not be the case now. I think they look, as stands, a top candidate to be a team that would really struggle to manage a Champions League campaign as well as a Premier League campaign. I wonder if that would have bad effects on their form all around. I mean, look, I know he's done a great job there so far, but it would not astonish me if Forest did make the Champions League. It wouldn't totally astonish me if the results were terrible and they ended up firing Nuno in January. That wouldn't be the wildest thing to happen in football in recent times.
Andy, in terms of one-off games, though, just look at it this way. Marcus, I don't know what you think about this, but if you look at, say, the profile of the teams that have made it into the knockout phase of the Champions League this season, right? Like, when Forest are really fit and firing and doing well, like that period of time where they won about 5 or 6 games in a row back in March, right? They beat Man City, they beat Man United. Fine, Man United haven't been great, but you know what I mean. They were looking good. They were playing well. Could that version of Forest beat PSV Eindhoven, Brest, Club Brugge, Atalanta, Monaco?
I think they're the wrong clubs to look at. I think if you're looking at why Forest would particularly thrive in the Champions League when Forest are their best, and like I said, there are caveats. Do they make it? Can they beef up the squad to an acceptable level to stop the scenario that I was just talking about actually happening? I think where they would really thrive in the Champions League is teams that are going to have a go at them.
Yeah.
And they want that. They want that. They want to be able to defend those teams who are going to have loads of the ball and then smash them on the break. You could see a situation where Forest had game after game against really big opposition. They have 30% of the possession and managed to get a draw or a win out of it.
Yeah.
Because that leans into their strengths almost.
With the players they've got, anyway, I still do think. I mean, maybe this is about style of play. Maybe I don't know. Say Club Brugge's style as well as you do, Andy. But I still think if Forest and Club Brugge play each other in a two-legged affair in the first knockout phase of the Champions League next season, Forest would be favourites for that game.
Yeah, I wouldn't
they
disagree
would,
with that.
And so that tells you in one way that tells you its own story, right?
I think with Forest, a lot of teams, I say a lot of teams, a few teams who can qualify for the Champions League for next season, they'll look at Villa's run and go, fancy a bit of that. Because on another night, maybe Villa sneak through against PSG, although PSG, they didn't, but you get what I'm saying. They've gone all the way to the quarter-final, and they've had a great run, and they've had some huge nights there. Forest will think we could do that. Now, clearly, as you mentioned earlier in the pod, if Aston Villa are in the Europa League, they'd be among the favourites, possibly maybe even the favourite, depending on who else is in there. Obviously, there's a bit of football to be played until that's all established or whatever. I think if Forest are in the Europa League, again, they're among the favourites. They could win that competition if they're in the Europa League next year. If they are, whoever ends up in a Conference League from the Premier League, we know they're among the favourites, if not the favourite. In the Champions League, I don't think anyone would make an argument to say Forest could win it next year. But once again, you find yourself in that league format where you're guaranteed, 8 games. You'll have some incredible ties. You know that the City ground will be absolutely pumping, to use one of Luke Moore's words, for every home game. And they'll think, okay, fine, we may not win it, but let's have a bloody good old journey like Villa had this season. So whatever the style of football, does it suit it, does it not, they'll have I think they'll give a good account of themselves because of all
I think it's a great point, Spell. Sorry to interrupt, but I just want to pick up that point that you're making about the Europa League. Now, to be horrendously unromantic, and you are going to experience a lot of that, whichever of you's rooming with me over the next week. Yeah. I think
no chocolates on pillows there.
No, you can't have the melting. But I think you look at it, and as you say, like the Europa League might almost be the perfect solution for Forest. Like the solution that no one expected them to make Europa League at the start of the season. Look, I know their fans will want Champions League. I want them to make the Champions League. I think it'll be phenomenally exciting. I think they deserve it after being up there all season.
Well, the league table will decide if they deserve it at the end of the season, Andy.
Yeah, right. They've been a wonderful story, and I think it would be great to see. But actually, managing, if you're not used to European competition, which collectively they are not at all, we have to say Villa were in European competition, although not the Champions League the season before. I think you look at that and you think, well, okay, they can manage, because of that Premier League power, they can manage the group stage of the Europa League without playing their first team all the time, or without playing their first 11 all the time. They'll be able to keep the wolf from the door in a Premier League sense. It will help them balance their efforts a lot better. And as you say, they'll be a genuine contender for the competition.
And they'll have to strengthen in the summer. Whatever happens, whichever competition they're in, they will do. Look at Villa, and much was made of Villa's January loan deals. They needed to get them in, and that gave them a little bit of something else. So that's what Forest will need to do. Their style of play, to go back to the question. Yeah, I think time would tell, but I think there's every chance that it could suit knockout football in the competitions. We thought it would suit the back end of the Premier League. We were saying that maybe at the halfway point in the league, that other teams, if they're tiring, they're all gung-ho, actually playing conservatively and then just conserving your energy and then going on raids and whatnot on the break and so on, that could do it. We shall see, because they've kind of coughed and spluttered a little bit, agonisingly going out in that FA Cup semi-final with hitting the bar and the post and all the rest of it. That doesn't help matters, but they're going to have to pick themselves up. So I think whatever they do, we know how they'll go about it, but they'll need more bodies in there.